Coach Daniel Morrison had protected his quarterback son from consequences for 4 years at Lincoln Charter Academy. But he'd never covered up assault against a teacher who was secretly the daughter of a federal appeals court judge. When 17-year-old Brandon Morrison and his football teammates tore Miss Rebecca Hartwell's shirt open during morning roll call that crisp September morning in Charlotte, North Carolina, they thought they'd humiliate another weak substitute into quitting. What they didn't know was that her father sat on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. Her phone was live streaming everything to her lawyer, sister, and their harmless prank would trigger a federal civil rights investigation that would end careers and send multiple people to prison within hours. Stories like this reveal something profound about how institutions protect perpetrators while silencing victims who seem powerless. When someone finally has the resources and connections to fight back, it creates space for others to share their own experiences with educational harassment and institutional cover-ups. Sometimes it takes one person with unexpected power to expose the systems that have been hiding in plain sight for years. The early morning mist clung to the football field at Lincoln Charter Academy as 24-year-old Rebecca Hartwell pulled her modest Toyota Camry into the faculty parking lot. Around here, pickup trucks and SUVs bearing football team decals and Morrison Pride bumper stickers dominated the spaces. A testament to the athletic culture that defined this working-class charter school in Charlotte's East Side neighborhoods, Rebecca appeared to be exactly what her personnel file indicated, a recent Harvard Law graduate taking a gap year to explore public education before beginning her legal career. What the administration didn't know was that her decision to substitute teach at Lincoln Charter Academy was far from random. Her father, the Honorable James Hartwell, had been nominated to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, specifically because of his expertise in educational civil rights law. And Rebecca had grown up listening to dinner-table conversations about institutional failures in public education. The gap year story was partially true. Rebecca had indeed graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School, but her real motivation for spending time in public education stemmed from her family's long-standing commitment to civil rights and educational equity. She wanted to understand the system from the inside before beginning what would likely be a career in educational policy and civil rights law. What made Rebecca's situation unique was the level of preparation and protection she carried into Lincoln Charter Academy. Her older sister, Sarah Hartwell Chin, worked as a federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights violations, and the two sisters had developed protocols for documenting and reporting institutional failures that could trigger federal investigations. Rebecca's seemingly ordinary smartphone was equipped with military-grade encryption and real-time transmission capabilities that could send evidence directly to federal prosecutors. Lincoln Charter Academy served 1,200 students from Charlotte's working-class neighborhoods, where families had been drawn by promises of smaller class sizes and innovative educational approaches. The reality was more complicated. While test scores remained respectable, the school's culture was dominated by a football program that had won 3 consecutive state championships under Coach Daniel Morrison's leadership. Morrison had built his reputation on discipline and results, transforming Lincoln's football team from perpetual losers into state champions through what he called old-school coaching methods. What this really meant was a culture where physical dominance was celebrated, authority was never questioned, and problems were handled internally rather than through official channels. The coach's influence extended far beyond the athletic department. As the school's most successful and visible leader, Morrison wielded enormous power over hiring, discipline policies, and institutional culture. Teachers learned quickly that challenging his methods or his players' behavior was a career-limiting decision, and female staff members were particularly vulnerable to harassment that was dismissed as boys being boys. At the center of this toxic culture was Morrison's 17-year-old son Brandon, the team's star quarterback and undisputed leader of the student body. Brandon had inherited his father's commanding presence and strategic intelligence, but he had also developed a sense of entitlement that manifested in increasingly aggressive behavior toward female students and staff members. Brandon's inner circle consisted of Jake Stevens and Tyler Walsh, both senior linemen whose families had invested heavily in the football program's success. Jake's father owned a construction company that had built the school's new athletic facilities, while Tyler's mother served on the charter school's board of directors and was one of Morrison's most vocal supporters. The pattern of harassment that Rebecca had come to document had been escalating for months before her arrival. Previous female substitute teachers had lasted days rather than weeks, citing difficulty managing student behavior in their resignation letters. What these euphemistic departures really represented was a systematic campaign of sexual harassment that had been normalized under Morrison's leadership. Rebecca's first week at Lincoln Charter Academy was spent carefully establishing her cover, while observing the culture that had been described in anonymous complaints filed with the Department of Education. She maintained the persona of an idealistic young educator who was grateful for the opportunity to gain classroom experience, never revealing the federal connections or legal expertise that lay beneath her professional exterior. The harassment had begun almost immediately, but in ways that were carefully calculated to maintain plausible deniability. Brandon had started making comments about her appearance during first-period homeroom, couching his remarks in language that could be dismissed as normal teenage behavior, while clearly focusing on her physical attributes rather than her teaching abilities. "Miss Hartwell," Brandon had said during their first morning roll call, "I really like how you keep us organized. You've got a really commanding presence up there." The words themselves were innocent enough, but his tone and the appreciative murmurs from his teammates made the sexual undertones unmistakable. Rebecca had responded professionally, maintaining her role as a substitute teacher while mentally cataloging the incident for her growing documentation. Her hidden recording devices captured every inappropriate comment, every meaningful glance, and every moment when the line between normal student-teacher interaction and sexual harassment was deliberately crossed. By her second week, the behavior had escalated to physical contact that was presented as accidental but felt increasingly predatory. Brandon had developed a habit of standing uncomfortably close during classroom discussions, brushing against her arm when asking questions, and finding excuses to visit her desk during study periods. His teammates had followed suit, creating an atmosphere where Rebecca felt constantly watched and evaluated in ways that had nothing to do with her teaching effectiveness. The most disturbing incident had occurred during her third week, when Brandon had cornered her in the equipment storage room adjacent to the gymnasium. Using his status as team captain to access restricted areas, he had entered the room while she was gathering materials for a health class demonstration, positioning himself between her and the door in a way that made his intentions unmistakably clear. "You know, Miss Hartwell," he had said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never faced consequences for inappropriate behavior. "I've been thinking about our conversations in homeroom. I think there are some things you could teach me that aren't in any textbook." Rebecca had maintained her professional composure, while her surveillance equipment recorded every word of the encounter. "Brandon, I think you should return to your study hall. If you have questions about course material, we can discuss them during regular class time when other students are present, but I like our private conversations," Brandon had replied, stepping closer and deliberately invading her personal space. "I think we understand each other better when it's just the two of us. Besides, who's going to know what we talk about in here?" The implicit threat in his words was unmistakable, and Rebecca had realized that her investigation was approaching a dangerous phase. Brandon's behavior was escalating toward a confrontation that would either provide the evidence she needed or put her in genuine physical danger. What Brandon and his father didn't understand was that Rebecca's seeming isolation was carefully orchestrated theater. Every conversation was being recorded and transmitted in real time to her sister Sarah, who was building a federal civil rights case that would be triggered the moment Brandon crossed the line from harassment to assault. The morning of September 28th arrived gray and humid, with the kind of oppressive heat that made Charlotte's autumn feel more like summer. Rebecca followed her usual routine of arriving at school 30 minutes before the first bell, using the quiet time to review the evidence she had collected and communicate with her sister using encrypted messaging systems. Her most recent transmission to Sarah had been particularly urgent, target behavior escalating to dangerous levels, physical assault imminent, based on established pattern. Federal response team should be on standby for immediate deployment. Evidence collection nearly complete. Sarah's response had been characteristically direct. All assets in position. Federal marshals briefed and ready. FBI Civil Rights Division monitoring live feeds. Execute Protocol Alpha if situation becomes immediately dangerous. Rebecca understood that she was approaching the climax of her investigation. The evidence she had collected over the past month painted a clear picture of systematic sexual harassment that was being enabled and covered up by institutional leadership. What she needed now was dramatic evidence of assault that would trigger the federal response her family had been preparing. At 7:45 a.m., she activated all her surveillance equipment and prepared for what she anticipated would be the final day of her undercover investigation. Brandon had been unusually aggressive during the previous week's interactions, and his teammates had been making increasingly bold predictions about what would happen to teachers who didn't know their place at Lincoln Charter Academy. The first indication that something was planned came during her morning homeroom period when she noticed Brandon and his teammates exchanging meaningful glances while she took attendance. Their body language suggested coordination and anticipation, as if they were waiting for a predetermined signal to implement some kind of plan. During her planning period, Rebecca discovered an anonymous note in her desk drawer that read, "Some teachers learn the hard way what happens when they don't show proper respect for Lincoln traditions. Today's roll call should be educational." The threat was vague enough to maintain deniability while making its intended intimidation perfectly clear. Rebecca photographed the note and transmitted it to Sarah while maintaining her outward composure. She had expected escalation, and the note confirmed that Brandon and his supporters were feeling pressure to act more dramatically. Her investigation had clearly touched a nerve. Even though her targets had no idea they were being investigated by federal authorities, the lunch period brought additional signs that something significant was being planned. Rebecca observed Brandon in intense conversation with several teammates who normally had little interaction during school hours. The coalition suggested that whatever was planned had broader support than just his immediate circle. At 12:30 p.m., Rebecca received a text message from an unknown number. "Assembly roll call today. Don't say you weren't warned about what happens to teachers who think they're better than Lincoln." The message was clearly meant to intimidate her, but it also provided crucial intelligence about timing and location that would help her surveillance equipment capture whatever confrontation was planned. Rebecca responded by discreetly adjusting her recording devices to ensure optimal audio and video quality for the upcoming incident. She also sent a coded message to Sarah alerting federal response teams to monitor the live stream from her hidden cameras, which would automatically activate if her biometric monitors detected elevated stress levels. The afternoon assembly was a monthly tradition at Lincoln Charter Academy, where the entire student body gathered in the gymnasium for announcements, recognition ceremonies, and what Coach Morrison called character-building discussions. The September assembly was particularly significant because it traditionally celebrated the football team's early season success and reinforced the values that Morrison claimed defined the school's culture. As students filed into the gymnasium at 2 p.m., Rebecca took her assigned position with other faculty members along the wall, her surveillance equipment automatically beginning to record the scene. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, as if the students sensed that something unusual was about to happen. Principal Jennifer Walsh took the microphone to begin the assembly, but it was clear that Coach Morrison was the real authority figure in the room. He stood at the center of the gym floor, surrounded by his players, his commanding presence dominating the space in a way that made everyone else seem like supporting characters in his personal drama. "Before we begin today's recognitions," Principal Walsh announced, "we'll start with roll call to ensure everyone is present for this important gathering." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken as she recognized this as the moment Brandon had been building toward. The morning's intelligence had indicated that roll call would be the setting for whatever confrontation had been planned, and she could see Brandon positioning himself strategically near the faculty section where she stood. As Principal Walsh began calling names alphabetically, Rebecca noticed that Brandon and his teammates were moving closer to her position. their coordination suggesting rehearsed planning rather than random movement. Jake Stevens and Tyler Walsh flanked her on either side, while Brandon approached from the front, creating a formation that would prevent her from easily moving away while maintaining the appearance of normal student positioning. Rebecca Hartwell, Principal Walsh called when she reached the faculty roster, her voice echoing through the crowded gymnasium. "Present," Rebecca replied clearly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system as she realized the confrontation was about to begin. "Actually," Brandon said loudly enough for nearby students to hear, "I think Miss Hartwell needs some help with her presentation today." The comment was clearly a setup, and Rebecca recognized immediately that Brandon was creating a pretext for physical interaction that would appear spontaneous to casual observers. His teammates moved closer, forming a loose circle that would prevent her from easily escaping while creating the appearance of a normal student-teacher interaction. "Brandon, please return to your designated position," Rebecca said professionally, maintaining her role while her recording equipment captured every moment of the planned assault. "We need to complete roll call without disruption." "But Miss Hartwell," Brandon continued, his voice carrying the false concern that had characterized all his previous harassment, "I noticed your shirt is all wrinkled. Maybe we should help you look more professional for the assembly." The manipulation was transparent to Rebecca, but she understood that Brandon was performing for an audience of 400 students and faculty members who didn't recognize the predatory dynamics underlying his seemingly helpful suggestion. He was positioning himself as the thoughtful student, offering assistance while making her appear unreasonable if she refused his help. "My appearance is perfectly appropriate for this professional setting," Rebecca replied firmly, her legal training helping her maintain composure while documenting Brandon's escalating behavior. "Please step back and allow the assembly to continue." "Come on, Miss Hartwell," Jake Stevens chimed in, moving even closer to create additional pressure. "Brandon's just trying to help. Isn't that what good students are supposed to do?" The comment drew supportive murmurs from some nearby students who didn't understand the harassment dynamics they were witnessing. Rebecca realized that Brandon's group had deliberately chosen this public setting to maximize the number of witnesses while creating a narrative that would make her appear unreasonable for refusing their assistance. "I appreciate the concern about professional appearance," Rebecca said, addressing the crowd as much as Brandon himself. However, appropriate student-teacher interactions maintain proper boundaries and respect personal space. Her response was carefully crafted to establish professional boundaries while creating a clear record of her attempts to maintain appropriate conduct. The surveillance equipment captured not only her words, but also the predatory body language of Brandon's group as they closed in around her. "You know what, Miss Hartwell?" Brandon said, his tone shifting from false helpfulness to barely concealed aggression. "I think you need to learn what it means to be part of the Lincoln family. Maybe it's time someone taught you about our traditions." The threat was implicit but unmistakable to anyone familiar with the dynamics of institutional harassment. Brandon was suggesting that Rebecca's professional boundaries were evidence of snobbery that needed to be corrected through some form of involuntary lesson. "I respect Lincoln's traditions of academic excellence and mutual respect," Rebecca replied evenly, attempting to move away from the group while maintaining her professional demeanor. "Now I need to return my attention to the assembly," but Brandon had no intention of allowing her to escape on her own terms. This confrontation was about power and dominance, and he was determined to demonstrate his ability to humiliate her in front of the largest possible audience. "Actually, Miss Hartwell," he said, reaching out to grab the collar of her blouse, "I think it's time you learned what happens to teachers who think they're too good for Lincoln Charter Academy." What happened next unfolded in slow motion as Rebecca's worst expectations became reality. Brandon grabbed the front of her shirt with both hands and pulled with deliberate force, tearing the fabric and exposing her bra to the shocked gasps of 400 witnesses. The sound of ripping cloth echoed through the suddenly silent gymnasium as students processed what they had just seen. For a moment, the entire assembly was frozen in stunned silence. Then Brandon began laughing, a sound that was quickly joined by his teammates and several other male students who found the assault amusing rather than horrifying. Now that's what I call a wardrobe malfunction, Brandon announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed he had achieved total victory. Maybe next time, Miss Hartwell will remember to show proper respect for Lincoln traditions. But Rebecca's response was not what Brandon or anyone else in that gymnasium expected. Instead of fleeing in humiliation or breaking down in tears, she stood perfectly still and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the sudden silence. Her legal training and family preparation finally revealing themselves. Brandon Morrison, she said, looking directly into his eyes, while her hidden cameras recorded every detail of his triumphant expression. You have just committed sexual assault in front of 400 witnesses while being recorded by federal surveillance equipment. You have also provided the final piece of evidence needed for a federal civil rights investigation that has been monitoring this institution for systematic harassment and institutional cover-ups. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Students who had been laughing moments before suddenly realized they had witnessed something far more serious than a prank gone wrong. Brandon's expression shifted from triumph to confusion as he processed what Rebecca had just revealed. "What the hell are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice carrying the first note of uncertainty she had heard from him. Rebecca reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew her federal credentials, holding them up for the crowd to see. "My name is Rebecca Hartwell, daughter of Federal Appeals Court Judge James Hartwell. For the past month, I have been conducting an undercover investigation into sexual harassment and federal civil rights violations at Lincoln Charter Academy. Everything that just happened has been recorded and transmitted in real time to federal prosecutors who are currently preparing arrest warrants and civil rights charges." The revelation sent shockwaves through the watching crowd. Students began backing away from Brandon and his teammates, suddenly realizing that their proximity to the assault could implicate them in a federal investigation. Several teenagers frantically tried to delete videos they had recorded, not understanding that the evidence had already been preserved by professional surveillance equipment. Brandon's face went white as the implications of Rebecca's revelation sank in. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're just a substitute teacher trying to scare us." "I don't need to scare you," Rebecca replied calmly, adjusting her torn shirt while maintaining perfect composure. "The evidence speaks for itself. Sexual assault, conspiracy to commit harassment, abuse of institutional authority, and violation of federal civil rights laws, all recorded, all documented, all ready for federal prosecution." At that moment, the sound of sirens became audible from the school's parking lot, growing louder as emergency vehicles approached the building. Rebecca's emergency protocols had worked exactly as designed, alerting both federal prosecutors and law enforcement to the assault she had just endured. "You set this up," Brandon accused, his voice rising with panic as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his privileged assumptions. "This whole thing was a trap. This whole thing was a federal crime," Rebecca corrected, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had dedicated her life to understanding and enforcing civil rights law. "I simply documented it. Every inappropriate comment, every unwanted touch, every moment of harassment was your choice, Brandon, and now you'll face the federal consequences of those choices." The approaching sirens grew louder, and Rebecca could see flashing lights reflecting off the gymnasium's windows. Her investigation was about to become very public, and Brandon Morrison's reign of entitled harassment was about to end in federal custody. The federal agents entered Lincoln Charter Academy's gymnasium like a precision military operation, their badges gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights as 400 students pressed against bleachers to create a pathway. Special Agent Lisa Chen of the FBI's Civil Rights Division led the team, her expression grim as she surveyed the scene that Rebecca Hartwell's emergency transmission had described in devastating detail. "Rebecca Hartwell?" Agent Chen asked, approaching the woman whose torn shirt and composed demeanor told a story that no witness statement could improve upon. "That's me," Rebecca replied, displaying both her Harvard Law credentials and her federal family identification. "Everything has been recorded and transmitted to my sister, Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Hartwell Chen." Per LibriVox, our pre-established federal protocol, the primary perpetrator is Brandon Morrison, son of Coach Daniel Morrison, who should be arriving momentarily to attempt damage control. Agent Chen nodded. Her team already moving to secure the crime scene and separate witnesses, according to federal civil rights investigation procedures. Mr. Morrison, she said, addressing Brandon directly while his teammates watched in growing horror, you're under arrest for sexual assault under federal jurisdiction, violation of civil rights laws, and conspiracy to commit harassment in an educational institution. You have the right to remain silent. Brandon's legs seemed to give out as the Miranda rights echoed through the gymnasium. Students who had been laughing at his prank minutes earlier now stared in shock as federal handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The sound of smartphones buzzing filled the silence as news of the federal arrest spread across social media platforms faster than school administrators could hope to contain. "This is insane!" Brandon protested, his voice cracking with the kind of panic that comes from realizing that privilege and connections couldn't protect him from federal law enforcement. "She's lying! She set me up! My father will have all your jobs!" "Your father," Agent Chen replied with the calm authority of someone who had spent years prosecuting civil rights violations, is currently being arrested in his office on federal charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and violation of his oath as a public servant. We've been monitoring his communications and cover-up attempts since this investigation began. The revelation sent another shockwave through the gymnasium. Coach Morrison, the untouchable authority figure who had ruled Lincoln Charter Academy for over a decade, was facing federal charges that would end his career and likely send him to federal prison. Rebecca watched the scene unfold with the professional satisfaction of someone who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment, tempered by genuine sadness for the students who were learning that their school's leadership had been built on systematic harassment and institutional corruption. These teenagers had grown up believing that athletic success provided immunity from consequences, and watching their worldview crumble in real time was both necessary and heartbreaking. Jake Stevens and Tyler Walsh, Brandon's loyal teammates and co-conspirators, found themselves surrounded by federal agents as their phones were confiscated for evidence. The conspiracy charges would extend to anyone who had participated in the systematic harassment, and their families' local connections would provide no protection against federal prosecution. "Miss Hartwell," Agent Chen said, "we'll need you to accompany us for a formal statement. But I want you to know that your investigation has provided exactly the evidence we needed to pursue comprehensive civil rights charges. The recordings, documentation, and real-time transmission protocols have created an airtight case that no amount of political pressure or institutional influence can dismiss." Rebecca nodded, gathering her materials and the torn remnants of her professional dignity. "Agent Chen, there's something else you should know. This isn't an isolated incident limited to Lincoln Charter Academy. My investigation has uncovered evidence of similar harassment cultures at charter schools throughout North Carolina and beyond. Brandon Morrison and his father are symptoms of a much larger institutional problem." "We're fully aware," Agent Chen replied grimly. "Your sister shared the preliminary findings with our Civil Rights Division last week. This arrest is the beginning of a much larger federal investigation that will likely span multiple school districts and involve dozens of arrests across the Southeast. The implications hit the watching students like a physical blow. Their charter school, which they had always viewed as a place of opportunity and advancement, was about to become the center of a federal investigation that would expose the toxic culture hiding beneath their academic achievements. As Brandon was led away in federal custody, his composure finally cracked completely. "Rebecca, Miss Hartwell, you don't understand what you've done. This community will destroy you. My family has connections you can't imagine." Rebecca turned to face him one final time, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had been raised in federal courthouses and trained in the most prestigious law school in the nation. "Brandon, your family's connections are about to become evidence in a federal conspiracy case. The same influence your father used to cover up your crimes is now going to be used to prosecute him for obstruction of justice and civil rights violations. The gymnasium had transformed from a typical school assembly into a federal crime scene, with agents collecting evidence, while school administrators tried desperately to manage a crisis that had already spiraled beyond their control. The carefully maintained image of Lincoln Charter Academy as an innovative educational institution was crumbling in real time, broadcast live across social media platforms that no amount of damage control could silence. Principal Jennifer Walsh, who had spent her career turning a blind eye to the football program's harassment culture, found herself facing Agent Chen's stern questioning about her role in the institutional cover-up. Her comfortable administrative position evaporated as she realized that her complicity in protecting Brandon's behavior had made her an accessory to federal crimes. "I never knew it was this serious," Principal Walsh protested, her voice shaking as agents examined her files of dismissed complaints and buried incident reports. Coach Morrison said these were just teenage pranks that got out of hand. "I thought we were protecting the students' futures by handling things internally rather than involving outside authorities." "You were protecting criminals," Agent Chen replied bluntly, her years of experience with institutional cover-ups evident in her tone, while creating additional victims. "Every complaint you dismissed, every incident you covered up, every time you chose the institution's reputation over student safety, you were enabling federal crimes and violating your oath as an educator." The scope of the institutional failure was becoming clear as agents reviewed years of complaints that had been buried, witnesses who had been silenced, and victims who had been forced to transfer schools rather than endure continued harassment. Rebecca's investigation had exposed not just individual crimes, but systematic corruption that extended throughout the charter school network's leadership. Meanwhile, in the school's administrative wing, Coach Morrison was experiencing his own federal reckoning as agents seized his computers, files, and communication records. The keys he had given Brandon to access restricted areas were evidence of parental enabling that would add additional conspiracy charges to Morrison's growing legal problems. "This is a witch hunt!" Morrison shouted as agents led him past the administrative staff who had implemented his cover-up policies for years. "That woman is a fraud who infiltrated our school under false pretenses. She's the real criminal here, not my son." Agent Chen paused to address Morrison's accusation directly, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority and moral certainty. "Mr. Morrison, Miss Hartwell is a credentialed legal professional conducting a legitimate civil rights investigation. Your son committed sexual assault while you used your position to enable and cover up his crimes. The only fraud here is the reputation you've built while systematically violating your oath to protect students." The watching staff members exchanged nervous glances as they realized that their own careers were likely forfeit. Years of implementing Morrison's policies and ignoring harassment complaints had made them accessories to federal crimes, and investigators would be examining every decision they had made and every victim they had silenced. Rebecca's sister Sarah arrived at the school within an hour of the emergency transmission, her federal prosecutor credentials giving her immediate access to coordinate with the FBI team. The two sisters embraced briefly, a moment of personal connection amid the federal law enforcement operation that had been months in the planning. "Becca, that was some of the most courageous investigative work I've ever witnessed," Sarah said, her voice carrying the emotion of someone who had watched her sister face genuine danger for the sake of federal justice. "The real-time transmission worked perfectly, and we've already got federal judges ready to sign additional warrants for the expanded investigation. The story isn't about me," Rebecca replied. Though she appreciated the recognition from her sister and professional partner, it's about the systematic failures that allowed this harassment culture to flourish. Brandon Morrison is just the most visible symptom of institutional corruption that extends throughout the charter school system. Indeed, Rebecca's investigation had uncovered evidence that the harassment culture extended far beyond Lincoln Charter Academy. Her documentation revealed similar patterns at charter schools throughout North Carolina, suggesting a regional problem that would require comprehensive federal intervention to address effectively. The students who had witnessed Brandon's assault and arrest were grappling with the realization that their school's culture had been built on lies and systematic harassment. Many had participated in or tolerated inappropriate behavior because they believed it was normal teenage conduct, not understanding that they had been complicit in federal crimes. Maria Rodriguez, a junior who had often been targeted by Brandon's crew for harassment, approached Rebecca with tears in her eyes and a voice shaking with emotion. "Miss Hartwell, I want to thank you for doing this investigation. I've been afraid to come to school for 2 years because of what Brandon and his friends did to girls like me. I never thought anyone would believe us or care enough to help." Rebecca felt the validation that made all the risk and months of preparation worthwhile. "Maria, you and every other student deserve to feel safe at school. What happened here wasn't normal teenage behavior. It was criminal harassment that should never have been tolerated by any educational institution. Will things really change?" Maria asked, her voice carrying the hope of someone who had endured years of institutional gaslighting and administrative dismissal. "Or will they just find new ways to cover things up and protect the popular kids?" "Things will change," Rebecca replied with the conviction that came from understanding federal oversight procedures, because this investigation has created federal civil rights monitoring that can't be dismissed or covered up by local politics. The Department of Education will be overseeing this district for years to ensure compliance with federal civil rights requirements. The ripple effects of Rebecca's investigation were already spreading beyond Lincoln Charter Academy. Federal prosecutors were following up on her leads, investigating similar harassment cultures at charter schools throughout the region. Civil rights organizations were reviewing cases that local authorities had dismissed, looking for patterns of institutional cover-ups that might warrant additional federal charges. Parents throughout Charlotte were receiving emergency notifications about the federal investigation, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about the culture they had created and enabled. The families who had supported the football program's success at any cost were discovering that federal civil rights violations couldn't be overlooked in the name of athletic achievement. Richard Sterling, Brandon's attorney and a prominent member of the charter school board, found himself in the awkward position of representing a client whose crimes had been recorded in high definition and transmitted to federal investigators in real time. The usual strategies of victim blaming and character assassination were useless against a federal judge's daughter who had documented everything according to legal standards. This is prosecutorial overreach and federal government intrusion into local education, Sterling declared to the media gathering outside the federal courthouse. "My client is a teenager who made a mistake, not a federal criminal. This investigation is politically motivated and designed to destroy a good family's reputation for partisan purposes." But Sterling's protests rang hollow against the evidence that Rebecca had collected with methodical precision: the recordings of Brandon's threats, the documentation of institutional cover-ups, and the testimony of multiple victims created a federal case that even the most skilled defense attorney couldn't dismiss or plea away. Rebecca's story broke simultaneously on national news networks that evening, accompanied by carefully edited footage from her surveillance equipment that documented the entire investigation. The headline on CNN read, "Federal Investigation Exposes Sexual Harassment Culture at North Carolina Charter School," and within hours it had been shared millions of times across social media platforms. The article detailed not just Brandon's assault, but the systematic institutional failures that had enabled it. Rebecca's documentation revealed years of dismissed complaints, silenced victims, and administrative cover-ups that had allowed the harassment culture to flourish without any meaningful consequences. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Federal lawmakers called for comprehensive investigations into harassment cultures at charter schools nationwide. Civil rights organizations praised Rebecca's courage while demanding systemic reforms to protect students and staff. Parents across the country began questioning whether their own schools were hiding similar problems behind facades of academic success. But perhaps the most significant response came from other victims who found the courage to come forward with their own stories. Rebecca's investigation had created a safe space for survivors to speak truth about their experiences. Knowing that their accounts would be taken seriously and investigated by federal authorities, within a week of Brandon's arrest, federal investigators had received complaints about harassment cultures at more than 70 charter schools across 15 states. Rebecca's investigation had sparked a national reckoning with educational institutions that had prioritized reputation and athletic success over student safety for decades. The legal proceedings moved swiftly, aided by the comprehensive evidence that Rebecca had collected with federal precision. Brandon Morrison pled guilty to sexual assault and federal civil rights violations, accepting a plea deal that would keep him in federal prison for 5 years and require lifetime registration as a sex offender. Coach Morrison faced more serious charges related to his systematic cover-up of harassment complaints and his conspiracy to violate students' civil rights. His trial revealed the full extent of his corruption, including evidence that he had actively silenced victims and destroyed evidence to protect his son and other privileged athletes. The charter school itself faced federal oversight and comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future harassment. Every policy was reviewed. Every administrator was retrained or replaced, and new reporting systems were implemented to ensure that complaints would be investigated properly rather than covered up for institutional convenience. Rebecca's investigation won the Department of Justice's highest award for civil rights enforcement, recognizing her courage in exposing institutional corruption while facing personal danger. But she used her acceptance speech to focus attention on the broader problem of harassment cultures in educational institutions nationwide. This case isn't about one person's investigation, she told the assembled crowd at the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. It's about the systematic failures that allow harassment cultures to flourish. When institutions prioritize reputation over safety, every school district in America should be asking whether they're protecting students or protecting perpetrators. The reforms that followed Rebecca's investigation extended far beyond Lincoln Charter Academy. Federal legislation strengthened civil rights protections in educational settings and required comprehensive harassment training for all educational personnel. States implemented new reporting requirements that made it illegal to cover up harassment complaints, and civil rights organizations received increased federal funding to investigate institutional failures. Brandon Morrison's case became a cautionary tale studied in law schools and education programs nationwide. The comprehensive documentation and real-time federal coordination demonstrated how modern technology and federal law enforcement could be used to expose institutional corruption and hold powerful people accountable for their crimes. For Rebecca, the investigation represented the beginning of what would become a distinguished career in federal civil rights law. She returned to complete her legal training, but she also established a foundation dedicated to supporting federal investigations of educational institutions that failed to protect vulnerable populations. The foundation provided resources and training for federal investigators to conduct undercover civil rights investigations, while ensuring their safety and legal protection. Rebecca understood that her success at Lincoln Charter Academy had been possible only because of extensive federal preparation, family connections, and cutting-edge surveillance technology that most investigators couldn't access. Years later, Rebecca would receive letters from students whose lives had been changed by her federal investigation. Some wrote to thank her for creating safe learning environments where harassment was no longer tolerated. Others shared their own stories of finding courage to report inappropriate behavior because they knew their complaints would be taken seriously by federal authorities. Maria Rodriguez, the student who had thanked Rebecca on the day of Brandon's arrest, wrote to tell her that she had become a federal prosecutor specializing in educational civil rights cases. Your investigation showed me that federal justice was possible, Maria wrote. I decided to dedicate my career to making sure other students never have to endure what we experienced at Lincoln. The transformation at Lincoln Charter Academy was comprehensive and lasting. The toxic culture that had flourished under Coach Morrison's leadership was replaced by an environment where respect and safety were genuine federal priorities rather than empty administrative slogans. Students learned about consent, boundaries, and civil rights through comprehensive education programs that addressed the root causes of harassment culture. New leadership at the school implemented federal oversight policies that encouraged reporting while protecting victims from retaliation. Anonymous reporting systems allowed students and staff to document inappropriate behavior without fear of consequences. And every complaint was investigated by federally trained professionals rather than dismissed by administrators, protecting their reputations. The athletic programs that had served as centers of harassment culture were restructured with new federal guidelines and clear accountability measures. Coaches were trained to recognize and address inappropriate behavior according to federal standards. And students learned that athletic success would never excuse harassment or assault under federal civil rights law. Rebecca's investigation had proven that even the most entrenched institutional corruption could be exposed and reformed through federal civil rights enforcement and comprehensive documentation. The techniques she developed at Lincoln Charter Academy became standard practices for federal investigators working on educational civil rights cases nationwide. Most importantly, Rebecca's investigation had demonstrated that federal justice was possible even when facing the most powerful and well-connected local opponents. Brandon Morrison's family influence hadn't protected him from federal prosecution, and Coach Morrison's institutional authority hadn't shielded him from federal civil rights accountability. The message resonated far beyond Charlotte. No one was above federal law when it came to civil rights violations, and no institution was too successful or well-connected to escape federal oversight when it failed to protect vulnerable populations. As Rebecca continued her career in federal civil rights law, she carried with her the knowledge that her work at Lincoln Charter Academy had changed countless lives and created lasting federal reforms that would protect future generations of students. The month she had spent undercover as a substitute teacher had exposed decades of institutional corruption and created a model for holding educational institutions accountable to federal civil rights standards. The bullies who had thought they could assault and humiliate her with impunity had instead provided the evidence needed to dismantle the entire system that had protected them. Their moment of entitled cruelty had become the catalyst for comprehensive federal justice and lasting institutional change. In the end, Brandon Morrison's assault in that crowded gymnasium had lasted less than 60 seconds. But the consequences of that assault, the federal investigation, the institutional reforms, the national conversation about harassment in schools, Tool Gride, would continue for decades, protecting countless future victims from experiencing the trauma that Rebecca had endured in service of federal civil rights enforcement. The story of Rebecca Hartwell's investigation became a testament to the power of federal preparation, family connections, and professional courage to create justice even in the face of seemingly insurmountable institutional corruption. And somewhere in federal prison, Brandon Morrison had years to contemplate how his moment of entitled harassment had ultimately destroyed everything he and his family had built through privilege and systematic cover-ups. Federal justice, it turned out, was not just possible, it was inevitable when truth was documented comprehensively and courage was backed by federal authority and constitutional law enforcement. The bullies had thought they were above consequences, but they had learned too late that some fights are won not with physical strength or local influence, but with federal law, professional documentation, and the unwavering commitment to expose civil rights violations wherever they hide behind institutional facades.